You know, it's terrific that you're all here to see this work that truly needs to be seen in person. And I think that's a testament to the strength of the work, is that this is work that cannot be seen on a screen or just digitally. It needs to be actually, we need to be present with the work and take it in the physical space. So thank you all for being here to see it. I just want to share a little story because it is really wonderful how there's this connections in Maine in our art community. And just a few months ago, I was asked to write a short essay for a catalog that's coming out on Warren Seelig, who's with us today, an artist that lives in Rockland and shows at Ellen Walsh Gallery. And in researching for that essay that I was writing, I came across this exhibition that Warren had many years ago, I think it was in the 90s, with an artist named Jane Lackey, whose work I was not familiar with at all. And I was so interested in that these two artists were really pushing the boundaries of textiles. And so then when Bethany called me and asked if I would do this talk with Jane Lackey, I said, oh my God, what a coincidence. I was just reading about this artist who I was unfamiliar with and who has this connection in showing with Warren Seelig. And then of course, I find out that she's also good friends with Katarina Wesleyan, whose wonderful show is at the CMCA right now. So, you know, it's just that there's never more than 2 degrees of separation in this wonderful community we call the Maine art world. So thank you for all of that. But Jane, I want to start out with this idea of textiles because I know your background is in textiles, and while it might not be immediately apparent in this work, I certainly see a through line in the works that are in this exhibition, in the suggestion of the woven surface, and also the idea of the repetitive process of weaving. And I also noted that several of the smaller works incorporate a line of stitching. Could you talk about the relationship between textiles and your current practice?
Sure. Hi, everyone. And I have a microphone here if I need it. Do I need it? Yes? Yes and no? Okay. Emmett, and you're hearing through the microphone? Okay. So I studied textiles. It took me a little while to find what I wanted to do. I went to university for a couple of years, the University of Tennessee, where I grew up in Tennessee, East Tennessee. And then my sister went out to California. I drove across country after my second year of college, got to California. I said, I'm not coming back. So I went to UCLA for just a short period of time, but somehow miraculously, I was in a room that had all of these catalogs for different schools. Pulled off California College of Arts and Crafts, opened it, textile department, and just knew at that moment that's what I wanted to study. And so when I went up to, I enrolled, I don't know how I got in, but I had, you know, a kind of blasé portfolio at the time. But I did get in, and I had a wonderful teacher there, and she immediately, her name was Trude Guermont-Pré. She became a mentor and a wonderful highlight of studying there. But on meeting me first day, she said, oh, you know, you really need to learn how to draw. And so I took that on as well. So I've always been kind of two-footed in terms of mediums. That's why I call myself a multidisciplinary artist. But it started early. Always working on drawing, maybe using it as something that I would generate a weaving, but often drawing for itself and often showing both together in an exhibition that I would have. So I wanted to, this work brought me back to that, which was long ago, but I wanted to express something about weaving that is kind of fundamental to it and to textile. Most textiles, when they're constructed, have some kind of linkage, like with crocheting, you know, you're kind of looping in and you're making a link. And you can think of almost all constructed textiles have to have some sort of connection. But when I was first learning to weave, I didn't know that as a general principle. I was learning, to make the warp and put the warp on the loom. And then got to the loom, got it on there, and started to try to understand now. So many things could have gone wrong, just getting this stuff over to the loom. And then what's going to hold it all together? So that was very first beginning kind of weaving in a studio where people were weaving with wire. They were doing all kinds of things that Trude Guermont-Bray was teaching us and encouraging us to experiment. But I was just learning. And what I did was I got a lot of books. Since I'd been in the university and learned things from books, I thought, well, I can look it up. And so I looked it up, and I would see these big diagrams of weaving blown up. And so I kind of got it, but still didn't. And it's not really until you do this, when you raise the threads and they cross each other, and you put your weft through, that I realized, oh, that's what holds it together, but it really is invisible. You can't see it. But you can take that, and so this work takes me back to that moment of discovery of what's this connection that holds a textile together, and how wonderful it is that it's there, but it's not always visible. And so that has kind of passed through maybe all of the work I've done. I'm very interested in things that aren't quite apparent.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so then that, in terms of sewing and that sort of thing, that all just kind of became my toolbox for how I think through work, whether it's considered to be any kind of traditional textile or a much more experimental type of working.
Well, I think the thread too as a line, so you're really sort of drawing. So the thread as you're going through is a drawing kind of concept as well. In that sense, especially in this work where
Yes.
the line of thread, the line of stitching becomes like a drawn line.
Yeah,
As well.
and it's the type of line that I can work with pens. I can work with a pencil, and sometimes I do, but there's a certain time when I want to take that small, shiny thread and stitch it in. And these, by the way, all of these works that you're seeing, both the drawings and works on paper, are all made on paper, with paper.
I'm also interested in this idea of accretion and redaction that carries through your work. There's this building up and sort of paring away, this kind of excavation of the surface that suggests and in a literal sense almost captures the sense of time passing. These works clearly are embedded with time, that they clearly take time to make, but also this sense of the literally, how do we make time visible? And I was just wondering if you could talk about that element of time that is embedded in the work.
Recently, someone else asked me, when you're making this work, what do you think about it? And I said, time. And on many different levels, when you make work that takes a lot of time, and my work is durational, and I'm always, I seem to always be involved in a process. I'm a process-based artist. I'm always involved in a process that to others might be totally too meticulous, but for me it's important to do it, especially that way that I need to. And so it can take quite a long time to go from start to finish, but there's many shifts along the way that we'll talk about. And one thing I'm always questioning is, can time be enfolded in a work of art so that it transfers to the viewer, the participant who's looking at it, and makes them also spend time. We look at things so quickly, glance, move on. So I'm trying to really take that and stretch it and extend it in the work I do. There's so many things I could say. Time for me is really related to space. I can't separate the two. And space and time come together in something that is like a map. I love, one of my favorite things is to look at maps and to follow. You can glance at something, put it aside, but you can also enter it. So the title of this series right here is Porta, which is Latin for gate or door, and maps to enter. So I'm trying through that element of burying some time in the work to extend and transfer that to the viewer.
I think that's really apparent because they really do reward, extended looking, because then you start seeing where you've left some voids and where all the choices that you've made, all the very subtle but really refined choices that you start to see, and then you start to get sunk into your space. I feel like I enter these. So the porta is a beautiful word because I think they do allow the viewer to enter into this creative world. And sometimes it seems like a landscape to me, and sometimes it seems like the sea, or sometimes it seems like sky, or I'm looking down onto islands in the water, maybe in this sense. So they do offer up those suggestions, I think, in that way. So I just want to go back to, in 2011, you were awarded a US-Japan Creative Artist Exchange Fellowship and spent time in Kyoto and the surrounding areas. And it's been noted that your work embodies the Japanese aesthetic of shibui in its very spare, quiet beauty. Did your experience in Japan influence your approach at that time?
It definitely, well, first of all, I was so fortunate to have that grant because it meant I could stay in Japan for 5 months. And my proposal was based on the fact that I had started doing some work where, well, I had a show at the art gym in the other Portland, Oregon, and it was called Choreograph. It was a 2-person show, and it was in a big gym space that had been converted into a beautiful contemporary museum. So thinking about that and my own interest in movement, and particularly movement of people that are looking at my work, I did a 27-foot long painting on cloth that was really based on, this is kind of how quirky things get. It was based on some things I had been reading about mobility studies. So those studies were made with tracking people's cell phones as they drove through a certain area and then coming up with some conclusions about how people move from one place to the next. So you can think about that, in a smaller way in terms of that community where it was done. But because people are moving all over the place at this point in time, you can also think about mobility as part of it's just part of our world at this point. So this long piece of cloth had a lot of circles already woven into it. I didn't weave it. It was a brocade piece, very thin cloth with these circles. So I went in with paint, and I had begun to use a lot of tape and other adhesive materials that would stick to the cloth and create this whole scenario of connections to the circles. So it was a piece about circles and lines. I'm sorry I can't show you a slide, but maybe you get the idea. And the whole point was also to have people be mobile in front of this piece and to have to walk from one end to the next and come up close to it if they needed to see detail. And then in a second room, I had a piece that was made up of, it was called Chalk Talk, and it was the first installation I had tried. And it was a whole sequence, almost like a little corridor you could proceed down, of chords that had rubber bands, really long rubber bands at the top, a cord, and then chalk. And you could pull it over to any place. What I was interested in is like, do we need to write things down on a blackboard? The whole wall was, the whole little room was painted black, blackboard black. And so, or can you stretch yourself over here and write something, whereas somebody else might be stretching themselves right here? So I was just interested in this whole crisscross of communication that was taking place on social media, but how does it work when we try to set that up with a hands-on situation? Now, those two were important about Japan because my proposal was based on circuitry in particular, and the fact that my work was people were saying, oh, you do a lot of circuitry. And there are pilgrimage circuits in Japan. Some of them are, one of them goes around the whole island of Shikoku, and there's 88 temples on that one, and you're supposed to walk, hike, some people take buses to all of those temples. And I was really interested in those particular spaces and walking through them and finding out how that kind of installation might influence, now that I was beginning to make some installations and wanting to have people participate in a certain way and through a certain sense of procession through them, how do they do it there? And often it's in very small spaces. So, and they manage to make those very small spaces seem huge. And so that kind of shifting back and forth. So I walked through temples for 5 months and did a lot of drawings. I never wanted to really, I photographed in those temple spaces and gardens and walkways, but I never wanted to reproduce what I was seeing. That was not the point. It was just to have that sensation of movement and slowing it down, speeding it up, etc. So
that's interesting because it ties right into what I think that you've accomplished in this work, because I found myself like really moving from piece to piece and going back again, because you start to notice the slight differences, the subtle differences, and then I would move to see the shadows cast, so you put your head like to see behind. So there was this, like, you were compelled to move through the pieces and go back and forth. So this idea of moving, sort of zooming in, stepping back, looking from the side, going from piece to piece and back again, that compulsion to move between the pieces, I think, was very strong in my sense of viewing. And I wrote that in an interview, you said that sometimes I feel like a human microscope, zooming in and out, blowing up forms to less recognizable shapes, or letting them go. And so I thought, could you talk about this idea of perspectives, these different perspectives, both microscopic and sort of macro, that's within your work?
Yeah. Well, one thing is I've always been really attracted to detail, and I'm nearsighted. So when I see detail, I think I see it really well. And I love working on a table. That's how I work first on these, and taking my glasses off and just zooming in with my own eyesight. We all have that we have something about us that if we're artists or creative in any way, that is affecting that. And I've always favored artists who have worked with the body, with an awareness of the physical body. And so there's that, and that is kind of what happens in the first phase of working. When I'm working on these pieces, like I said, it's on a table, flat. I'm covering them with adhesives. I'm covering them with labels, with all sorts of things. So I can't, ultimately, I have to use my vision to get everything on there in the places I want, but then I'm blind to it. I paint over it. I can't see it. I'm still trying to envision it while I make it. And so then there's another phase where I uncover it and I think, oh my goodness, this is not satisfactory at all. What have I done here? It doesn't look exactly like I thought it would. And so I then start to work at it, taking the pieces to the wall and looking at them straight on, and stepping way back like you were wanting to do today around in the gallery space. And creating that in my working process.
Well, the nature of your work with the grid, and of course you're being in Santa Fe, I can't help but think of the work of Agnes Martin, who also has this, infinitely subtle works that beg close examination. And so I'm just wondering, is her work an influence, and has the New Mexican landscape been an influence on your work?
Both, very, very definitely. When I first went to New Mexico, it was when that cross trip to California, and I had, having grown up in Tennessee, it's very humid there. I had lots of allergies. So when we got to the end of Oklahoma and passed into New Mexico, it was suddenly like, I can breathe. Oh, it feels so good. It's so light here. There's not humidity in the air. I knew I had to come back at some point. So that's
interesting.
part of my drawing. But it was also the beauty of it. It's just, I just hadn't seen it's beautiful where I grew up. It's amazing. And my parents were always wanting to drive around and show that to us. But this was a different kind of beauty. Then, I was drawn to New Mexico. I didn't know about Agnes Martin at that time. But in graduate school, I put these two things together. I had in graduate school at Cranbrook, it's a 2-year program, and in the second year, you're forming ideas for your, what's called a thesis show, the end of the year show. You really want to have achieved something interesting and unexpected. And I had a review with the faculty, and at that point, all of the faculty came in, and so it was like 6 or 7 on one. And Danielle Libeskind, who is the architect of the World Trade Center and the Jewish Museum in Berlin, had just started being head of architecture there. And so he kind of landed on this. I had done a weaving, and my type of weaving was warp ikat. And I thought of it very clearly. This is painting. This is a way of making your canvas and dyeing it so that it has the imagery that you want. And so I had this probably like 3-foot piece that he was looking at. It was dark stripes, and it had these little squares of color that moved along the stripes, and I had gradated that. So you kind of had to move. It was about movement and the light coming from the darkness. Well, he just tore it to shreds, and he couldn't get used to the idea of a piece of cloth being on the wall. I felt like he's an amazing person. He was teaching us amazing things about phenomenology, and why couldn't he see what I was doing? And So that flattened me out. But I had to make my thesis show. And then somebody, I'm not sure how close these two things were, but someone in my class came through with a little brochure that had a lecture written by Agnes Martin, and also showed me some of her work. So suddenly I have this experience of someone who's writing about beauty, who's writing about happiness. That's really unusual in a graduate program. We did not, we didn't talk about that stuff. And the other thing is, I realized what I was doing that wasn't getting someone's attention, which was filling space. I was filling space, and I needed to empty space. That was what solved my problem and led me on to some work that I was very proud of. And Libeskind was also very noticing it very much. So, yes.
That's very interesting. So you were filling space and you found that what you really need to do is the empty space. So that void, yeah.
And it matched me well, because I'm sometimes I'm very interior, and it was quiet. And then that whole idea of, why do you do this anyway? And that's what he was questioning, really, was what is this? And I had to answer that question.
Well, for me, the work also brings to mind like visualizations of sound waves and Morse code and genetic mapping in particular, I thought really came to mind. I'd love for you to speak about this idea of language and communication in your work, and the idea of making the unseen and the unspoken visible. So if this is a way of addressing the empty space, this idea of addressing the unseen and the unspoken that you're making visible, the idea of how do we visualize sound waves? How do we visualize genetic mapping? All these things that we know exist or they're there, but how do we bring them to sight?
And did you feel that you get that from these pieces in particular, or from
some of these? Yes. Like, I don't know, some of these drawings, they look like, the genetic mapping sometimes, and or just the sort of erratic up and down lines that they look like sound waves to me, sort of visualizations of that.
Yeah, that's another aspect of something that is going on, that is a force that exists that we're not able to really see. It's not tangible. You can't really see it, but you feel that sense of vibration, or feel that things are not as flat as we might think sometimes. And so I became so interested in the middle 90s about the genetic mapping the genome. That was just totally fascinating to me, because it's not land-based. It's a little tiny part of each cell that's folded into a cell, and it's it can be represented with 4 letters. I found that just totally fascinating. Like, all this information, and we're all the same. We all have it. So it was proof to me, too, that again, this whole idea of connection and of connectedness to other people, but the infinite variation that comes with it. So a lot of my work, in a lot of my work, I used some of the genetic mapping, right? Actually, just kind of stamped into some works that were painted that were convex or concave, so that they kind of mirrored your body as you stood next to them. And sometimes I actually used dots and dashes as Morse code, as a mark within the work. to also express, that we can communicate, how we can communicate with each other through systems that are totally silent. And then I guess the other thing, one of the best representations of language was I've always, as much as I love to look at a map, get lost in a map, I also love to do that with a dictionary. And so I've always had these in my studio. I've always had a great big old dictionary. If I wanted to look up something, it was there. And then eventually, we start to use our phone instead. But I collected, and seeing, these dictionaries are not so important anymore, I started collecting them, and I started making what I called Webster's lines, which were very long pieces made up of cut dictionary pages that I built into a system that would link up so that all you would see was little bits of ink on the edges of paper. You wouldn't see words, you just saw this ink. Occasionally maybe a thumb index, from the dictionary, so that you weren't really invited to touch them, but you could get that sense of that tissuey paper of a dictionary and all the words that are there that have made up all the literature that we have in English. I'm talking I've used other language dictionaries, but most of mine were Webster's dictionaries because they were Webster's lines. So I think people felt, in that striation and pattern, and also that length of walking, I think people felt maybe the sound of words there, or the sound of communication.
Well, I mentioned too that some of the work also reminded me of, musical compositions for people like John Cage, sort of experimental, musical scores. And so I was just wondering do you listen to music when you're making this work?
This work in particular, sometimes I do. Sometimes I listen to something if I'm doing something where I don't really have to concentrate much. It's more about the repeated element. I often try to bring the world in. I listen to podcasts. I listen to other things that I can learn by. But John Cage and his silent piece, and Steve Reich and his looping, interspersed in his probably most well-known work, that was a testimony that was about racism. I just find that work to be mesmerizing and just so deeply thought-provoking without having a lot of words.
Mm-hmm.
People still are, they redo his silent piece, and people are still talking about that.
Well, it's what you were just saying too about you needed to let the space go. It's about embracing that void. So the work in this show, I understand, began at the start of the pandemic in March of 2020, just after you returned from installing the Seat of Learning, which was a large-scale participatory work that you created with your husband, who's an architect, at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs, and then which unfortunately had to abruptly close just after you installed it. And it was, I understand, a multi-year piece and investigation. So that must have been quite unsettling. So can you talk about the conception of the Seat of Learning and then the experience of the closing and segue into this new body of work from that?
Yeah. If anybody's super interested in the Seat of Learning, there's a few catalogs back in the back, and I'm just going to sum it up because I just looked at my watch.
Yeah.
We do want to leave some time for questions from you all. Maybe there's something you'd like to know more than we've covered, but she's amazing. She could have just answered my questions. So the seed of learning came from, my husband and I don't usually collaborate, but we did once a long time ago, but then we decided that we wanted to do something together, and we had collected this old desk with the open, space underneath the desk and a little piece of it that comes around. And because I had been making some installations that I would invite people to write something, I would ask a question and invite them to write and design the whole space to make it easy to do that. I thought this little desk will be my next writing space, but after talking about it a lot and talking about our own experience learning and how learning has changed so much since that old desk was used, that we wanted to put this question out to the public and ask, would you bring us an object that you've learned something from, and that you're willing to have an interview with us on, and that you're willing to loan it to us if we choose to have it part of our installation. And so we went it was a contemporary museum in a little milk truck, not a museum, I shouldn't say museum, but contemporary space in a milk truck that goes around Santa Fe. So they agreed to let us do interviews and video those interviews in their truck, and we would set up in different places and do calls. We were not asking for art objects, so who knows what we're going to be brought. But we did the interviews. It was really interesting. So that meant they were videoed. I could edit the videos and have the objects that we chose to use. Each of the interviews were videoed, and also notes on them. And then we designed a space for this, all these objects and the stories about the objects of what people had learned. And the space was made of cloth that you could see through. So if you didn't want to go into it, as many people don't want to go into a tight space, you could see it all pretty much from the outside. You could see a video from the outside. You could listen to a little video that was in the chair, in the desk. So we're trying to touch all levels. How do we communicate this? How do we get people inside and be interested? And then it did have to close because it opened on the end of February 2020, and suddenly we had COVID. But fortunately, it was up for a couple of weeks before all of that, really took off. And then they were able to open it back up after some months. We were going to leave it. It was going to be there 9 months anyway. So they were able to open it back up and take advantage of it. And I think it was actually okay because, as it turned out, it was best to have about 10 or 15 people in there at a time at most. And, so they wanted people to be respect what materials were, etc. So classes could use it there and the public could make appointments to come in. So that had taken quite a bit of time, and I wanted to get back to my studio alone, not collaborating. And so I needed something because I hadn't been working on my own individual work for a little while. I needed something to kind of get it rolling. And I decided to start doing drawings like you're seeing back there at the entry or over here in the morning, first thing, entering the studio. And instead of, kind of having that feeling of staring at a blank space or trying to figure out what you're going to do, I'd just become involved with these drawings and how they entered the space, opened the space, and just each morning I would do those, and then in the afternoon I would start to work on, something else. And eventually this is what developed. So all of these pieces started out as very small drawings. That drawing, that suite of drawings right back there that is 12 were all the drawings, little drawings that I did with that piece right over there. That one. And you can find it in there and maybe see how, well, if you're drawing something one day or you're drawing something different the next day, I might just be working on the one that I drew before, but slightly differently. And I think that we learn so much from comparing things. How do we know anything if we aren't able to compare? And that's another aspect of the work, why it has similarities, but it also has differences. And how does that also capture time with others?
So maybe you could just expand a little bit on your process, because I think people would be very interested, and we can kind of end that with, how did you start using the little sticky labels? Because I think a lot of people, well, once you understand that these are those little price stickers, the little sticky labels that are then the markers kind of on the space. And so maybe we'll end there with a discussion of process.
Yeah, and you might have to ask me some more questions, and you might push me to the point where I'm not going to say anymore. But I think it was when I was doing some of those pieces that referred to sound on the disc, like it was almost like a satellite dish surface that I was making paintings. And the paintings were actually made on cork. That's another fabric that I like. Cork can be bought in a fabric form. I liked that I had worked on felt before that. The cork was a little more durable, a little harder. So I guess I wanted these disc-like things to feel like sound was sort of reverberating out of them. So I would paint a series of thin layers of paint, and there would be a color. And I just picked up, I thought, well, I've got these dots that I use for my slides and various things. I'll just put that on the surface to maintain that color, and then paint it all over with white again. So I go back and forth between placing something that's sticky on the surface, painting over it, taking it off, and seeing what I got. Did I get that depth that I wanted? And that's how it all started. And then when I went to Japan and I was drawing these different spaces that had gardens and buildings, etc., and not realistically, more abstractly, I would use these big, again, office supply labels, all different sizes, and place them on the paper, paint over, pull off, maybe add some stitching at some point, and make my composition that way. And so this work, once when I was working, I just looked at the small sticker sheet and thought, that's kind of perfect. I think I'll just stick with that size. And then what it added up to was that it made, this thing that looked a little bit like weaving. And it really began to emphasize the crossing of horizontal lines and vertical lines. And I could emphasize those interstices, those points where lines cross with a different color, whatever. I just learned that I could work back and forth. And that's what became so time-consuming, but I couldn't stop myself. And then the other thing is, about 6 years ago, I did start cutting, when I would take a sticker off, I started cutting the paper that was left there out. So that's why, the reason I did that was because I was using, in painting, a lot of times I was using gradation of color from light to dark. If you have white, the white of the paper entering that field of lines that are going from light to dark, it just kind of reduces that um, sense of gradation. So once I cut it out, it was like, oh, yes, there I'm finding, I work in a very flat way. Okay, there I'm finding depth. So
Yeah.
that's how that all started.
Literal death. Yeah. So I'm thinking about that. I'm sort of in awe that you were there cutting these. Yes, but I love that when you look up close, you really see the handmade quality of it too. That these are not machine cut, and that your hand is there, and that the lines and the dots, so there is that sense of the hand that's very much in there, which goes back to weaving too. That weaving those lines. So, thank you.
Well, the other thing I would like to say, and it goes back to movement and my interest in movement, is that a lot of times people say, your work is very meditative. And I say, well, maybe, but actually I'm moving as fast as I can. I'm not contemplating. I want to get it done. I want to see it. So I'm having a race with myself, and my hands, are moving to put the stickers on and pull them off, and then I'm cutting and cutting and cutting. So I'm very aware that this movement is going on. And is it entering the work? Is it transferring to you? I'm asking that question.
That's very, very interesting, because yes, they appear to be meditative, but there is a little bit of a static quality to
I love
static energy. Yeah. So, does anyone have any questions? We'd love to open it up if there's any conversation.
No, you need to stretch and think of, Warren, okay, not too hard, all right?
I'm just curious, you're a brilliant weaver, years ago, when we showed together, all past before that. And there's something that goes on in the process of weaving that's extremely organic, the way that threads accumulate together for that's unique surface. And these are done very differently from those things. Do you miss weaving? Do you miss that process of physically putting the threads together in the way it happens to weaving versus this way of putting together?
Sometimes I think, well, it would be interesting to sit down at a loom, and I'd probably do something really small just to see how it felt to do it, and what would I, how would I treat it at this point in time. But I stopped because that work, I was weaving for about 15 years and putting telephone wire in and creating those kind of pile surfaces of wire. It pretty much, I had to sit at the loom to do it, and I began
I guess I'm thinking about the organic process, or the way that these cloth gets put together is a whole unique experience in the world, And these are analogous to those, but there's a cloth that already exists, I think, when you start with these.
the paper. Yeah, I know what you're saying.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. I don't think about the whole.
Because I do think run and say that one. Never seen that.
Yeah, I did, I think it was sitting down all the time that I really had to get up and move around and do something. When you're weaving, you build it from bottom to
I never thought of that.
top.
You're
stationary.
You're stationary.
And I just needed to get around, and start to move more. It's more in my nature.
Or are you just using an X-Acto knife and a ruler?
Yeah.
That's what I want.
Oh, I don't use a ruler.
You don't use a ruler?
No.
So how do you keep it so straight?
I just concentrate. And sometimes I don't. I mean, what she's saying, you can see, sometimes I think everything in my work is just a big mistake, but it's all sort of one's hiding the next one.
Or is the the thing you're cutting into tacked down? Do you
Oh, it's on the table. I think that's what makes people wonder, like, how does she cut it? Because it's not hanging on the wall like
Right,
this.
so but if you have an anchor with heavy things or something to keep it from moving, or is it fluid on the table?
It's adhered to the table.
With something soft underneath?
No, I take a risk. I put some table adhesive on the table because it can't move. And then if it is already in a state where I've taken it off the table and move it back and forth, I have little tiny weights.
Yeah.
I use those all the time for everything. I love them. So yeah,
But are you working on a cutting mat, is that it?
yeah.
That's right. I also want to compliment the hanging system, which I just thought was brilliant. I just want to point that out. You know, that this wonderful way that you've installed the work as well. Because they hang off the wall and allow those wonderful shadows to happen and the work to sort of breathe and move. But it's such an elegant solution, that plexi strip. I hadn't seen it before. And as soon as I saw it, I thought, well, of course, this should, you know, what a great system. So a compliment on that. So thank you. Yes.
The storage must be, how do you store them?
I make foam core portfolios and you know, store them flat and stack those up.
In the back.
I was amazed with the substance of your business, that and yet you've taken paper to its most fragile point by cutting away so much, and yet these pieces have so much like substance. I love that. And I thought Warren's question about the weaving, and I immediately saw the threads when they part and the way the shadow goes through.
Yeah,
And you're talking about wanting space in your work, and yet you're working with this two-dimensional surface that you're trying to get space.
yeah.
And it's really fascinating to see that tension, you know, and I feel it in talking, hearing about your process, that you're working against the skin and trying to find something in it and waiting for that moment when it reveals itself. And I think you've been very successful. It's great work.
Thank you, and thank you for what you said. That's I love hearing what people are thinking about, and I wish I could record that. Did you want me to answer anything, or?
No, I just wanted to
Okay,
share.
thank you, thank you.
Does anyone have another question?
You mentioned that you're married to an architect, and I see elements of architecture in this work. I wonder how living with an architect has influenced you.
Okay, he is more of an interior architect, and although he's now designing some buildings, which is great. We met in undergraduate school in California, and whenever we go someplace, we love to go to any kind of building that's new and or old, and so it's wonderful living with someone like that because we share so much interest together, but we separate ourselves when it comes to our work, except being probably each other's best and worst critic.
That was part of my question, I think. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jane, for this conversation.
I wanted to thank everybody for coming. It's so wonderful to meet so many of you and to have some old friends that have shown up here. It's just great to see you and that you made the effort to come. I know we all could have been sitting at home on the edge of our seats at this point in time, but instead we're talking about art. That's good. And thank you, Speak Well. Thank you, Speak Well, and thank you, Bethany, for all you've done for this show.